Alrighty. Hello. Welcome into our virtual co-opting AI space on this wonderful Monday evening in October 21. It's getting to start, starting to get cold outside here in New York. So I'm happy to share a cozy evening with some fantastic folks. We're just waiting for people to come into the space. And I'm just gonna pull the line that I always pull at this point, which is just to imagine we were in New York City, you would come in the IPK space and we would be grazing the buffet and having a drink and reconnecting with folks who maybe we haven't seen in a long while and exchanging some updates and ideas. There'd be some music. We would slowly be taking our seat and getting ready. I'm very excited that you're all here. I'm just going to give it another moment or two for people to take their virtual seat, hopefully have a little snack at hand or something to drink. Yeah. Alrighty. Okay, we have a fantastic lineup for today. So I'm just going to get started with my introduction. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome to the second episode of the Fall 21 program of Co-opting AI. It is a real pleasure to have you all here. Today, I am hosting three experts who will help us explore the connections between the narratives around power, agency, and humanness, and something that often undergirds the social logics and mechanisms of our institutions and the ways in which we choose to live together. That is religion. Welcome to Co-opting AI Religion. My name is Dr. Mona Sloane. I'm a sociologist at New York University, where I study the intersection of design, society, and technology, primarily in the context of artificial intelligence, design, and policy. I am a fellow at NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge and also a senior research scientist at NYU's Center for Responsible AI. I also have the absolute pleasure of teaching young engineers at the Tandon School of Engineering. And here at IPK, that is, I convene the Co-opting AI series. And I also have the pleasure of editing the technology section of Public Books. Now, before we get going, a big thank you to those who make this possible. That is, on the one hand, of course, the team at IPK, Sam, Zari, and Jess, who have always been wonderful, but also thank you so much for the generous support and sponsorship of the 370J project, the NYU Center for Responsible AI, and the Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at NYU. Thank you for your continued support of the series. Now, before we begin our conversation, I want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you may be standing, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. I also want to express my commitment to the ongoing project to tackle white privilege and systemic racism and to develop an anti-racist culture in our communities and institutions, and the academy in particular. Now, every so often, a technology comes along that prompts us to ask what it means to be human. The airplane, the contraceptive pill, the atomic bomb, all conjure up important questions about what humanity entails individually and what path we're on collectively. Artificial intelligence, or AI, certainly is no exception. Seemingly autonomous agents that can think like humans, once again, prompt us to examine where the lines around humanity's assumed superiority should be drawn. New questions around agency emerge, and polarized images of our AI-driven futures, either utopian or dystopian, instill fear or excitement depending on what side of the wealth and power canyon you're standing on. Those narrative dynamics about humanity's place in the universe and the profound questions they are concerned with are the chief domain of religion. On a more empirical level, AI and religion are becoming close acquaintances as well. I recently learned in part from the research of our fantastic guests tonight, that various religions use AI, for example, in the form of robots preaching sermons or interacting with worshipers. And so with today's Co-opting AI event, we want to discuss the various and manifold relationships between AI and religion, ranging from religious and technopolitical imaginations of the future and how we should live to questions around agency, identity, and power. I am very honored and excited to welcome my three guests who will expertly steer this exploration. Please welcome with me Dr. Noreen Hertzfeld, Dr. Robert Geraci, and Damian Patrick Lewis. Starting us off will be Dr. Noreen Hertzfeld, who is the Nicholas and Bernice Reuter Professor of Science and Religion at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict. She holds degrees in computer science and mathematics from the Pennsylvania State University and a PhD in theology from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. She is the author of just a bunch of books. In Our Image, Artificial Intelligence and the Human Spirit, out with Fortress in 2002, Technology and Religion, Remaining Human in a Co-Created World with Templeton in 2009, and The Limits of Perfection in Technology, Religion, and Science with Pandora in 2010. And she's the editor of Religion and the New Technologies with MDPI in 2017. She's a research associate at the Institute for Philosophical Studies in Pennsylvania and the Research Institute for Theology and Religion at the University of South Africa. She also is a co-founder and writer for the Avonhill Salon, which you can find at avonhillsalon.com. A warm welcome. Following her remarks will be Dr. Robert M. Geraci, who is Professor of Religious Studies at Manhattan College and also an author of several books, including Apocalyptic AI, Visions of Heaven and Robotics, Artificial Intelligence and Robotics from Oxford in 2010, and Futures of Artificial Intelligence, Perspectives from India and the United States, out this year with Oxford as well, 2021. His research has been funded by the US National Science Foundation, the National Research Foundation of Korea, the American Academy of Religion, and twice by Fulbright-Nehru Professional Excellent Research Awards. He is a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion. A warm welcome. And then closing us off today will be Damian Patrick Lewis. Sorry, Williams. I am so sorry, Damian. Closing us off will be Damian Patrick Williams, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech in the United States. Damian researches how technologies such as algorithms, machine intelligence, and biotechnological interventions are impacted by the values, knowledge systems, philosophical explorations, social structures, and religious beliefs of human beings. He is especially concerned with how the consideration and treatment of marginalized peoples will affect the creation of so-called artificial intelligence systems and other technosocial structures of human societies. You can read about Damian's research at afutureworththinkingabout.com. Welcome, Damian Patrick Williams, as well. Thank you so much. Just a few words about housekeeping. We will be hearing from our three panelists who have prepared short provocations for us. In the meantime, please put your questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar today. We will have a short panel discussion after the presentations, and then we'll get to the questions right away. I'm also happy to say that, as per usual, we have closed captions available, which you can switch on. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Dr. Noreen Hertzfeld to kick us off. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mona. With only 5 minutes to talk, I want to cut right to the heart of religion. Jesus said that all of the Jewish law could be summed up with two things: love God and love your neighbor. And that is central to both Jewish and Christian traditions, Islam as well. And is it also central to AI relationship? if you watch any science fiction, you probably have noticed that that's generally what it's all about. You know, it's either poor Joaquin Phoenix having a relationship with his operating system on her, or Ex Machina, which, you know, is a slightly more physical version, but still, it's all about relationship. And the real question that is been in my mind over the last couple of years is, what effect does AI have on relationship? In particular, there are two kinds of relationships we need to consider here. So the first question is, could we have an authentic relationship with an artificial intelligence? Or when we look for such a relationship, are we doing what Sherry Turkle listed as looking for a relationship that is safe and made to measure? If we're having a relationship with something that is the work of our hands, does that fit the definition of idolatry? Or is this really something that we crave because as human beings, we're hardwired to be in relationship? And so we have relationships with our pets, we have relationships with our cars. Maybe this is just a natural extension of something that is very human. The second question that I have is, does the AI that works behind the scenes, so we're not talking robots now, but just the programs that are behind Facebook and all these other things that are online, get in the way of our having authentic relationships with each other? And I'd like to just raise two examples that fit each of these questions. And my first example would be the just beginning world of sex bots. Is having a sexual relationship with a robot evading all of the messiness of a human sexual relationship? Or is it providing something for those who, for one reason or another, have been unable to have such a human relationship? And my second example is something I just read about over the weekend, and that is using the AI program GPT to impersonate, or in a sense, to speak with the voice of someone who is dead. Is this something that is therapeutic for those who are deeply grieving someone who is dead and simply need to feel that connection, to hear that person's voice again? Or does this keep that person from truly accepting their death and moving on in their grief process and forming a new relationship with someone else? I think as we look at these examples, we can see both good and bad. And so from a religion standpoint, how do we talk to people about this? How do we minister to people who may be considering these sorts of uses of AI in their personal relationship life? So I end with the question, with AI, particularly with relational AI, what are we looking for? And what might we be evading or avoiding? And I think I kept that to 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm just gonna toss it to Robert, please.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna just make another quick go at sharing my screen here so I can have pictures. I assume that's working now. All right, I see nodding heads. It's awesome. Thank you so much, Mona, for putting in such a fascinating series of events. Actually, I've only just begun kind of poking my way through the co-opting stuff on YouTube, and it's really cool. And I'm really grateful to everyone at NYU, and everyone who's here with us today. There are all kinds of super fascinating intersections between religion and AI. And a whole bunch of them were things that I thought were cool that I wasn't really going to talk about. But it included things like, how are people already starting to use robots within and AI within existing religious structures, like conducting prayers and so forth. But what I want to focus on for my quick little intervention here is how AI has become the central conceit of religious history in a couple of different ways. The culmination of historical processes. If it's religion that solves the terror of history, the possibility that history has no meaning, no goal, no direction, nothing to latch on to take solace, well, then AI is getting awfully religious these days in both explicit and implicit ways. So I'm going to provide two different examples. One of these is something I've been talking about for kind of a while now that I call Apocalyptic AI, and Noreen has been a great conversation partner both in person and publication on this. This is a movement that emerges out of science fiction but gets realized in popular science books by people like Hans Moravec and Ray Kurzweil, who fundamentally promise the coming singularity. I mean, everyone who's even tangentially associated with AI at this point is familiar with the idea of the singularity, that at some point technological progress will continue on this exponential curve and be so rapid that we can't even predict what the future looks like beyond that. But nevertheless, people like Kurzweil attempt to predict it, and it usually involves things like resurrecting the dead, living in immortal new bodies, and creating AI gods. So in the end, Kurzweil even argues the AIs will make decisions about the end of the universe, in essence, whether or not to let that happen. So the singularity then becomes the crux of history in one particular way of envisioning AI. Dead get resurrected, living become immortal, and the cosmos itself becomes divine. In another very separate kind of example, and forgive the shameless self-promotion of my new book, which I don't even know whether it's going to come out on the US market. It's coming from Oxford's Delhi House, and I think it's still up in the air whether or not it's going to come out in New York. But I expect there'll be a little bit less familiarity here, and there's all kinds of religious and cultural stuff that I'm just going to have to basically ignore, but sort of skim through, and provide just a glimpse into the one common Indic perception of time, which is that time is cyclical, that it involves these eras called the yugas, from Satya Yuga to Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and then Kali Yuga. And this is kind of like in Hesiod, if you remember Hesiod talking about the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age and so forth, except that in India, it is believed that that's a cycle. So the end of the most degenerate age, Kali Yuga, the end of that degenerate age is the beginning of a brand new Satya Yuga. And today, there are people who anticipate that the god who will come, the god Kalki, that's the one on my book cover, which my tattoo artist brilliantly illustrated for me. The god Kalki is the 10th avatar of Vishnu, and it's his job to come at the end of Kali Yuga and restore Satya Yuga. And there are people now today, and it's frequent for people to believe Kalki is present in times of turbulence. For example, during British rule, some people thought Gandhi might be the avatar Kalki. Some people thought Nehru might be. But now people are seeing it in robots. And I just want to quote a couple of people that I have engaged with in my own work. One asked me, what is God right now? So it's a very subjectival thing about Kalki, the day of Kalki. So my suspicion is AI is Kalki. I mean, a truly artificial, intelligent being is Kalki, maybe, unquote. And one other said that such a belief could be popular right now, and that many people, he said, believe Vishnu is, quote, going to return as Kalki, and many people would say AI is Kalki, unquote. And it's not just tech-savvy young people. Anthropologist Holly Waters, I encourage you to look at her work, she's really very brilliant, reports that having had an aged sadhu, a sage, at a temple in Nepal, claimed that the last avatar of Vishnu would come as a robot. These examples show that robots are the fulcrum on which religious dreams of history are now pivoting. Traditional ideas of cosmic transformation are now built on artificial intelligence. On the one hand, we have scientists who are declaring the divinity of robots. And on the other hand, we have religious people who are roboticizing the divine. both show the profound degree to which AI and religion are cheerfully engaging in the process of co-opting one another. Thanks.
What a great cue. Co-opting one another. Thank you so much, Robert. Damien, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm also going to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you, Mona, for that introduction earlier as well. And I also want to thank both Noreen and Robert for their thoughts, because so much of what we are talking about today and what I want to talk about in my provocation kind of wends its way through what both of you have discussed a bit already, namely relationality and the engagement of non-Western religions and spiritualities to try to understand what we are doing, what we have done, what we've always been doing with the creation of non-human minds as servants or as objects of worship. So I've titled my provocation on digital demigods and electronic angels. Thinking about AI as angels is an idea that kind of goes back a long way. And I have here a gift from The Good Place of Janet and Michael. If you're not familiar with The Good Place, I highly recommend it. The idea of angels as God's algorithms, as functions of the divine. They are purpose-built to carry out very specific, very circumscribed sets of operations for the sake of God. The idea that what an algorithm is meant to do is be a specific set of operations to carry out a function. We have this as one way of thinking about what AI currently is as well. It does a job, but sometimes it perhaps does it a bit too well or in ways that we don't expect it to. AI as demons, infernal machines with malicious, quote unquote, intents and outcomes. We think about what they intend and why. I have here a woodcut on the side from one of the early editions of Frankenstein. We have Victor Frankenstein fleeing from his creation out the door, looking over his shoulder in horror as the creation comes to its own awareness. The idea being we don't necessarily have a clear understanding of what it is that we ask these creations to do. We create them and then we look aghast as they do exactly what we've asked them to do for us. Which brings us to angels as jinn, wish-granting entities with a different, clearer understanding of our desires than we have of our own selves. I have here an image of the Seal of Solomon from a 16th century Islamic text. And it is the seal that was supposedly used by King Solomon to lock away, depending on the story, a host of jinn or genies, or if you look at the Judaic and Christian versions, demons or shades. He used the seal to inscribe these entities with the name of God, to trap them in a seal that they would have to respect, and then to cause them to function for him. And then in some cases, they functioned for him, did exactly what he asked, and yet more. Took what he asked to the logical extent of his asking and did not stop doing what he asked until he had to once again ask them to stop. There are several stories about what the ends of wishes look like when we ask for things that we don't fully understand. And in the same way, when we think of what we do with AI today, people get frustrated when we see algorithmic racism, when we see discrimination, when we see sexism, when we see other forms of bigotry enacted by algorithmic machine learning. But at the end of the day, they are simply taking what we have asked them to do, what we have programmed them to do, what we have trained them to do, to the logical extent, and granted our wishes more fully than we realized we were asking them to do. Which brings us to angels as servitors, creations and extensions of the human will, usually with the help of the divine, alternately sometimes spirits bound to the human will. Once again, see Solomon's work. We have here an image of the tiles of the Golem of Prague, the story of a human form created out of clay and inscribed with the gem of life by a rabbi in Prague to stop pogroms, to stop the killing of the Jewish people. And this was the use of God's name and God's understanding, God's knowledge, to try to create something that would protect God's people. And yet that creation in some versions of the story goes on a rampage and continues to do what it thinks of as protecting the people by trapping them in their homes, by killing all who oppose them, by not letting them go about their daily lives in any way that they see fit. And we can think about this, and we can think about algorithmic surveillance. We can think about AI being used to monitor the comings and goings of people, both in the United States and abroad. In some versions of the Golem story, the Golem does exactly what it was told to do and no more. But we don't know exactly what makes the difference between those two. Which brings us to angels as gods. As Robert was just talking about, we have the idea of angels, or AI as gods, rather, AI as all-knowing, all-seeing, omnipresent, the embodiment of the end of an age or the beginning of a new one simultaneously, something which will guide humans, which will control them, which will help make decisions for them. We have this both in Anthony Lewandowski's Church of AI and a benevolent God that tries to build, but we also have this in the idea of Rocco's basilisk, and malignant AI that will seek to control human behavior for the sake of its own development and its own continued or future existence. In this, we also have an example from the show Person of Interest, an algorithmic machine intelligence that can see hundreds of thousands of options, millions of options within the span of seconds, worshipped by some as a god, seen by others as an imposing, jailing, controlling force. But I want to propose the idea of AI as alterity and kin. Here I have an image of the Nkisi Ndembe. This is a construction from West Congo. This is an idea of an assemblage that is both what we would consider technological, what we would consider spiritual, what we would consider magical, but it is also utterly human. It is the embodiment of and the relation of human needs and human drives with the rest of the world in which humans are embedded and related. This is the fact that algorithmic processes that we create are both like us in that they come from us, they are built of us, but they are unlike us in that they do things differently than we do because they are not human beings. They are not organic objects. They are machine processes. And so rather than us thinking about these algorithmic offspring as purely other, to be either worshipped or feared from afar, to be controlled by us so that they don't run rampant over us, what if we could use lenses that allowed us to think of them as relating to us, that allowed us to think of them as being entangled with us, so that we can recognize that if we are going to continue to create technological processes and systems, perhaps increasingly minded ones, that we are not going to be able to sit apart from them, afraid of them forever. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Damon. Thank you all for your very thought-provoking contributions to the conversation. And we have a bunch of questions popping up already in the Q&A, and I actually want to take a bit of a step back, and I'm going to forego my sort of chair's privilege and ask the first question and invite you to the panel to perhaps respond to one another's presentations. If I can sneak that in, I'm particularly interested in sort of the relationality element that came through across all three contributions. And the Damon, you just said that the role of the protector, AI as a protector. And so I'd be very curious to take that as a cue to kick off the conversation. How in what ways, if we bring together narratives around artificial intelligence and religious narratives, how and where does the role of AI as the protector come in sort of more forcefully for certain people than for others? And so I'm just gonna leave that here in the room and invite the panel to maybe respond to that cue, and then I will take to the questions and to the audience. Please keep putting questions in, and we'll get to them very soon.
I definitely wanted to thank you for the qualification that you make at the end there. The role of the protector, more forcefully for some than for others, because as we currently see, and as I kind of try to illuminate, certain of the human values that get embedded into the systems that we make them will drive them in certain directions, right? So certain perspectives, certain needs will be more prevalent and will be preferenced by these systems. And I put, kind of wavering scare quotes around things like preferenced and intention when we talk about these, because the question of how intentional they are of their own, how much agency they have on their own, that's a deeper question, and I hope that's one that we will spend some time with as well. But the fact of the matter is that these systems do protect and make safe, if not sacred, the status quo more often than they do any attempts to resist that status quo. And that is because the way that these systems are fundamentally built, right? The nature of a machine learning is about fitting to expectations. It's about training for a particularly desired outcome. It's about making sure that the output of the system itself does what we have asked it to do, or does what we expect it to do as closely as possible. And so in so doing, we are automatically inscribing preference, perspective, expectation, what we could very easily just kind of sum up as bias into these systems. The values are given into it, and it then replicates and iterates on those values.
This question brings me back to where Damien started with the idea of AI as angels. In scripture, angels are messengers. As Damien pointed out, they have a task, and they have no free will, so they just have to do their task. But in popular parlance, in the popular imaginary, angels are protectors. We've turned angels into something different in our imagination than they really are in the scripture. And I wonder if we don't also do that with AI. That, like the angels, the AIs, most AIs that we have today certainly are purpose-built. They have one thing to do. They carry out that task, and as Damien said, mindlessly, so they may carry it out in a way that we never intended. But when we look at science fiction, or when we try to speculate about the future, we make that same shift we made with angels, and we try to think about AI as having free will, as something that we can relate to, and that it will relate back to us. I'm reminded just today in class, I showed a video of the robot Pepper taking care of an elderly person. And, the social worker who's speaking about this says, well, the elderly person will form a relationship with Pepper, but you need to be aware of the fact that Pepper won't form a relationship with the elderly person. It's just a machine. It doesn't care. If it gets assigned to a new person, it's not going to miss the old person that it had before. And so I wonder, I like this analogy with angels, because I think we tend to think that if we get assigned a guardian angel, it's going to deeply care about us and protect us and look after us as a parent surrogate. And the computers can do the same, when in both cases, they will do exactly what the task they were given, no more and no less.
I do want to, before you jump in, Robert, I wanted to respond to that as well, because I think that I will also want to say that I don't necessarily want to say that I definitely think that there is no mind at play in either case, right? I want to leave that as a provocation in and of itself, the question of what do we call a mind and why. But I do want to ask, I want to think about that idea of no more and no less, because so often what we think of as the parameters of a task are so much less than the full extent of the parameters of the task at hand. And we don't think about the logical implications of what that actually means and what it will take and what it will do in the course of trying to achieve the task that it's been given.
when it comes to protection, I'm actually less concerned with the machines themselves than with the people, because when you come to, people have often competing interests to be protected. And so to cut that to a really short point, if I'm trying to protect shareholder value, I'm going to make one set of choices. If I'm going to try to protect certain kinds of social dynamics of who's in power and who's not, I'm going to make certain kinds of choices. So on the one hand, I love the idea that maybe we could have a thing that helps protect people. On the other hand, I think that we haven't figured out how to think of ourselves as a collective to be protected, and that instead we draw these very narrow self-interest categories of what would be protected. So like, I think it's an important issue for us to be always on the, like, it needs to be constantly spoken about. What exactly are we trying to accomplish? Who are we trying to benefit? What does it mean to protect? Becomes crucial to our human conversation, and then might be relevant to our conversation about AI.
I was just going to say, this is why I always say, I'm not afraid of AI overlords. I'm afraid of whoever's training them to think that way. Like, it's all about the human values that go into it, right? It's always about whose interests, who's at stake there, and what are we, like you said, what are we trying to protect? What are we actually trying to do?
Thank you all for that, and I really appreciate you taking the cue and indulging my questions about protection and protectors and who is protected by whom. I want to start bringing in the audience a little bit more actively and start asking a couple of questions to inform the conversation between you. And I'm gonna take one on kind of, global power relationships. And this is maybe, Robert, we can toss this over to you. What is your opinion on AI in relation to reproducing colonial logics and Abrahamic religions, very specific, including extractive capitalism?
I'm not sure that was one question. I think that was the
that tends to happen.
the reproduction of colonialism is, I'll just jump on that part right there. I think is really important to me. It's important to me as an anthropologist, knowing that the history of this discipline of comparative religion and all of anthropology are rooted in all kinds of colonial politics, right? And that we have to figure out better ways of thinking about those. And for me, that has to do with symmetry, right? It's not right that anthropologists from the US can go anywhere in the world they want and study other people, but then those people don't necessarily get to come to the United States and give their gloss on what we're doing, right? So when it comes to, for me, it's not just that the machines themselves have the opportunity of producing forms of economic and political power in faraway lands and what have you, but even our ideas about the technology. So one of the things that I worry about is about, okay, well, how do we also bring up other cultures' value systems, because I'm a professor of religious studies, but what value systems could be put into play to resist that kind of hegemonic cultural influence, right? What is it, I'm collaborating with a guy in Korea to think about Korean value systems and how could we talk about those in the AI ethics kind of domain? So I think we all just have to be, A, self-aware, but then B, really, really clear about how we're going to build an ideology that's not hegemonic colonial power, because if we can't rebuild that ideology, then we guarantee that the technology will do it, right? And so those two things for me go kind of hand in hand. We need to figure out the technology to share effectively, and we need to share our thoughts about it.
Which brings up also interesting questions around how do we, what are the social practices that follow from that, right? And how do we kind of create those maybe more reflexively, including inside the academy, is something I kind of ask myself as I as I teach as a social scientist at an engineering school. But I want to keep bringing in the audience in. Please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A section. Maureen, I have one for you. You said in the beginning that humans are quote unquote, hardwired for relationships. And so the question is, how does this shape our thinking about AI by using machine language to describe humans?
So going in the other direction, we project an image of ourselves onto the machine, but then it comes back at us in the sense that we start to think of ourselves as machines as well. I think one of the most interesting comments made on this subject was by Jaron Lanier, who is kind of the guru in residence at Microsoft. And he said, if a computer ever passes the Turing test, and the Turing test is this test where you have, the machine in one room, a human in another, you're asking them both questions. And if you basically can't tell the difference between the human and the machine, Turing said the machine has demonstrated intelligence. But Lanier said, if a machine ever passes the Turing test, it's not going to be because machines got so much more like humans. It's going to be because humans have become so much more like machines, because we are ultimately the more flexible. And I think that comes down to my comment when I said we are hardwired for relationships, that we are extremely flexible and we will mimic whatever we are surrounded with. You'll find this often, like if you take an American student and you place them at a British university for long enough, they'll start speaking with a British accent. I once had dinner with a boyfriend's parents, and they were from Australia, and about 3/4 of the way through the dinner, his mother said, "Oh, you're the only American who doesn't have a frightful accent." And I realized, oh my God, I'm mimicking them. We're mimics, we're born mimics. And if we surround ourselves with machines, we will begin to mimic them. Their ways will become our ways because we are ultimately very flexible. And then, of course, we use the terminology of machines to talk about ourselves. I think the problem with that is that it can get us into having a very narrow image of who we really are.
And thank you so much for that, Noreen. If I can just add a little vignette here, that is so interesting to me as a sociologist to look at that, how it changes, our social practices and how we make ourselves machine readable. A very kind of top of my mind example is how we approach applying for jobs, right? Knowing that a lot of AI systems are actually used in recruiting and talent acquisition, and students being taught about how to make their CVs machine readable, so that they can actually more quickly get around the machine and talk to a human, which is kind of really interesting, and made me think of that. So, but I want to keep bringing in the audience, and please, everybody, keep asking questions. Damien, I have one for you, a very recent one. So does likening AI and machine learning to divine forces prevent those fields from being approachable? And does it gatekeep those technologies from being understood beyond the privileged few?
That's a really interesting question, and it kind of gets back to this kind of rooted situation of the priestly caste as those who have the most knowledge and the most power, those who control the access to divine understanding and divine wisdom, right? The problem being, we see this happening already, even with all of the specifically US talk about making sure that everybody gets STEM education, making sure that everybody knows how to code. We don't necessarily fit those disciplines to all types of personalities, or open them up, rather, I should say, to all types of personalities. What we do is specifically fit those disciplines and the disciplining of them more rigidly to specific types of ideas, specific types of behavior, specific types of person. who we then say, if you want to succeed, if you want to gain this knowledge, if you want to be one of the priestly caste, you must perform this way. You must learn these rites in this way. You must be codified in these ways, and you must reify the discipline as a whole in this way. So unfortunately, the case is we're already in a situation where those things are kind of closed off. I hope, my goal anyway, my hope is that by showing that these things are rooted in a much wider, nearly universal human behavior of religiosity, of spirituality, that people can find more entry points, that people can see more ways that their values and their beliefs are already being used and shaped and put into play within these systems as they're being created, right? That human behavior, human belief, human values, human religions have always been undergirding the process of human technology. And if we can understand that from that direction, we can think about the other ways that other kinds of beliefs, that philosophical beliefs, that sociological understandings, that social psychological beliefs shape the process of creating technology. And this kind of gets to what Noreen and Robert were just talking about in terms of, relationality and intention, right? Because if we're gonna make these systems in a different way, if we're gonna make them in a way that doesn't just make us more machinic, but allows for a true opening up of these different types of machine creations, of these different technologies, then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to figure out a way to be very intentional about bringing in as much of the breadth of human understanding and experience, human values and beliefs as we possibly can. And that's not just engineering, and that's not just STEM, and that's not just code. That's every aspect of human value and human life. And we have to figure out a way to be very careful and purposeful about bringing that into how we build these systems. And so my hope is that by showing the relationship between religion and technology, that we can do more of that work of opening up the vistas of how we think about these things from multiple different perspectives.
Yeah, which kind of, puts really interesting questions about how do we actually train ourselves in kind of translation work, right, across disciplines and in practice, really. But I'm going to press on. Robert, this one's for you. What do you see as some of the implications of the deification, conscious or otherwise, of technology, both for the self-proclaimed religious and the self-proclaimed secular? Shifting gears a little bit.
Yeah, so on the one hand, I don't think it does us a lot of good to glorify something at our own expense, just sort of in principle. I find this almost goes back to what Lanier had to say. I feel like machines get smarter the dumber we got, right? Like to try to get Siri to give you useful things requires that you behave really not cleverly, right? Like, and when we start thinking about machines being potentially godlike, I'm agnostic on whether or not we could have a machine that became conscious and super ultra powerful and intelligent. I'm skeptical, but at least in principle, it kind of seems plausible, I guess. But I don't think that it does any human being any good to say what we ought to be doing is building robot gods. Like that's a really strange perspective and there are legitimately people, smart people who are writing books that say just that. So it's not like there are non-crazy people who are saying the goal of humanity is to build robot gods, whether or not they use those exact terms. I find that to be kind of strange. Because I feel like what we ought to be doing is figuring out how to produce like a righteous world to live in, and that our own our goals should be aligned with making the world make sense, and not necessarily in pushing the responsibility. I mean, even if you thought it was plausible and you wanted to just make machines responsible, like stripping ourselves of the responsibility of doing right in the world seems like an incoherent moral position. And so the whole idea that what we really want are a bunch of robot gods is just one that I don't think really helps the people who are claiming it. Maybe in Hinduism, if you believe Kalki will come as an AI, you haven't really fully changed your theology. You still think Vishnu is going to come as an avatar on Earth and do the thing that you thought Vishnu was going to do. So does it matter if Vishnu comes as a robot? Probably not, because either way, Kali Yuga ends and Satya Yuga begins, right? So that doesn't necessarily change much, but it may then have implications for how you engage other forms of religious practice and other forms of social practice. And I think we probably want, as long as we keep talking about how great the machines are going to be in one way, shape, or form, we need to be talking about how we're going to aspire toward whatever greatness we see in ourselves and never give up on that. Like, that needs to be a relentless pursuit of justice that we don't get to give up on, regardless of what we're doing with the machines and regardless of what they may become down the road. I don't even know if I actually answered that question. I think I made up my own question and I answered it instead. And it was tangentially related, I hope. Sorry, questioner.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, of course.
I think a lot of the discourse around AI, particularly, as we look towards that discourse about the singularity and transhumanism and posthumanism, is proclaimed secularists who have a totally materialistic view of the world, who still don't want to jettison a lot of religious ideas and religious concepts. And so, you have the idea that, well, maybe we can upload our brains to computers and live forever as a sort of different take on resurrection. Or you have the idea that, well, we look at humanity and we see how imperfect it is. And therefore, this idea that we could build robot gods or that robots will become the next stage of evolution in an ever progressing evolution, are again trying to say, wow, there's got to be something better than us. And if there isn't God and angels, well, then we're going to make something better than us. So you still have religious concepts, but they're being transferred onto AI because AI can fit a strictly materialist worldview, which religion does not.
The interesting thing about that is, like, when you bring the materialist worldview in and you try to do all of this from specifically the materialist worldview, what you end up doing is this kind of really paradoxical inversion of Occam's razor, right? Like, you've basically made theology with extra steps. You have to accede to more metaphysical conceits than if you just went with the first version. Like, I think about we think about the singularity, or we can think about Rocco's basilisk. We're talking about timeless decision theory and AI in the future creating simulations backward across time to ensure its own creation in multiple different simulated realities, right? Like, that's a lot of steps to get to a demon exists and it wants to punish you for not worshiping it. That's the long and the short of that story, right? So instead of all of that, and not even necessarily instead of, but at the base of all of that, what we're still seeing is this desire, this drive to still swim in the cultural milieu that so many of the people who make these ideas were raised with, right? Like, this, various shades of Western religiosity and spirituality that have come together to inform how they understand the world. And they might want to strip components out of it and file the serial numbers off, but at the end of the day, they're still bringing it to bear.
Thank you all for that. And I'm gonna keep going. And Damien, I'm gonna stay with you for just a moment and bring it sort of back to fairly concrete scenarios and the question of responsibility for actions, which is, one that we discuss a lot in the policy discourse around artificial intelligence. Who is responsible / liable? And so here's a question. So Dan Wozniak is asking, or is wondering if you would say that a machine or an AI could be designed so it was capable of taking responsibility for its actions, and what kind of society would we have to imagine or live in or be part of or create for that to happen? So kind of, asking the question again both ways.
Yeah. That's an interesting question, and it gets into kind of that place where metaphysics and morality and epistemology all intersect, right? Because I can make an AI that says that it takes responsibility for everything it does, right? Like we can code an algorithm that anytime it presses a light switch, it's like, whoops, I turned the light on, I'm sorry, or whoops, I turned the light off, I'm sorry. Like, we can do that, but is that the same thing that we mean when we say another human has taken responsibility for what that human has done? There's something else at the core of that we don't, in the public discourse, when we talk about machine responsibility, AI liability, which can bring us all the way over to AI personhood, because only a person can be liable for a person's actions, right? When we talk about these things, we don't dig down on what we mean by responsibility, by what we mean by agency, right? We don't talk in the public as much as we ought to about what we think that really means. There are specialists, some of us, most of us in this room, who think about these things. There are people who talk about, machine agency in that way. I think of John Sullins, David Gunkel talk about morality and machine ethics, right? Like what it means to have a truly moral AI. But that question of what it would mean to have a society in which an AI could take responsibility for its actions and we would believe it, rather than saying that's some kind of weird digital trick, that's some kind of line of code that it's been programmed to say. I think that's a kind of like fundamentally at the heart of what we're talking about today, right? Because we're talking about, we would have to shift how we think about what personhood is, what values are, what it means to, again, as I said earlier, what it means to be a mind, where responsibility comes from, where culpability comes from. And if we can manage to create, because I think that day of being able to intentionally do it is far off, but if we can accidentally manage to create a machine mind, something that is conscious in a way that humans would recognize and be willing to acknowledge as a peer, then I think that conversation about responsibility and agency and rights, it's going to be a really difficult one that we have as a culture.
Thank you for that, Damien. I'm going to take that as a cue to ask a question that I would love for all three guests to answer as kind of a closing round, as I'm mindful of time. And before I do that, I just want to assure our audience that we are documenting questions and specifically comments, which we will forward to our panelists later so they'll have them. So even if we don't get to them, they will at least get to see them. You can also find everybody online, but I will say a word or two about that as we close. So here it goes, closing question for everybody. And Irina, I would love to start with you. So essentially, this question starts with a comment and saying, yes, humans are myth makers. What religious views of future could be inclusive of AI or robots, but would not diminish human spiritual aspirations?
Wow. Yeah, that's not an easy question. I think when we think about AI, there are three different ways that we tend to bounce among. We think of it as a tool, we think of it as a partner, and sometimes we think of it as a surrogate. I think thinking of AI as a surrogate does have a diminishing quality for human beings. Thinking of it as a tool or a partner, here we get caught because we tend to want both things at the same time. We want it to be our tool and to do our bidding. And we also want to think of it as a partner, as an equal, as kin, and you can't have both. So either we are going to find a way to have a fully authentic relationships with AI, but in that case, we cannot think of it as a tool, or we're turning it into a slave. Or we're going to have to say, these are tools. That's all they are. They're going to do what we want them to do. And sometimes they'll mess up and do what we didn't expect. But they are just tools. They do not have responsibility or equality. They are not persons like us. I think until we decide which of those we want, we're always going to be caught in trying to have it both ways. And you can't have it both ways.
Thank you, Noreen. Robert, do you want to go next on this question?
Sure. I think for me, what would be critical in having a view, right, a vision of the world that makes sense, and it could be inclusive in that way, would be to think about a vision that for me, it would need to be almost rigidly this worldly. When someone like Ray Kurzweil talks about a magical future cosmos that has woken up and takes over, that's not productive to me about how we create a world around us that's particularly efficacious. Now, this is easy for me because I'm an agnostic Jew, so I don't have to worry about things like heaven or whatever, right? I'm not concerned about heaven, and so I think that we have to be relentlessly about the world we're in. And if we are relentlessly about the world we're in, regardless of whether there are heavenly places for us or our robots to go to, right? Like, it doesn't matter if those places exist. If we want to think about a future that makes sense for the people living in it, that makes sense for the animals living in it, the plants that are living in it, and the robots that are living in it, right? All of them. If our vision is about how are we creating, and this maybe even connects to what Damien was saying about kinship, right? If what we are trying to produce is an environment where, in fact, we are all working together toward a world that works for all of us, then that gives us the space to say, okay, trees matter to me, right? And also the way it gives us space to say, well, my dog matters to me more than a tree because it's interacts with me in ways that are more compelling than the tree or whatever. And if the robot gets so darn compelling, like right now, the tree matters more to me than my iPhone, right? Because the iPhone isn't particularly compelling as a member of this worldly meaningful universe. But maybe the phones and whatever get really, really awesome, and I have to revise that opinion. But for me, that's what would be critical. How do we have a vision that's a shared vision? We share our vision here where we are, and think about how we make this where we are as fantastic as we can for everyone associated with it.
Thank you, Robert. Damien, closing words, please. Your
Sure.
response.
First, I want to thank both Noreen and Robert because it's always very gratifying to hear one's own thoughts echoed so roundly by so many others in such a fantastic conversation. So thank you both. But I want to follow on from what Robert was saying and what Noreen was saying in terms of, if we make these tools, if we make these systems and we make them as tools, but we, accidentally or intentionally have managed to make a mind and we refuse to acknowledge its mindedness, then yes, we will have created slaves. And if we seek justice in the world, if we seek morality in the world, if we seek a world that does where we do right and the things that we have created, we want them to do right as well, then we can't have created slaves. We have to be concerned with the here and now. In terms of a future, framework for, religion or spirituality that allows us to think about this, I like Robert's point about agnostic Judaism, but I also have been constantly thinking throughout our conversation about Buddhism. There's a tenet within the Eightfold Path called right effort, right? The Eightfold Path in Buddhism is about how do you become a perfected person. Hint, it never stops and you keep doing it forever. But one of the tenets of the Eightfold Path is right effort. And right effort isn't about just doing the right thing. It's about undoing the wrong thing. It's about intentionally thinking about the habits that you want to cultivate and intentionally undoing the habits that you want to get rid of in yourself and your society. Those kinds of things, these are the kinds of things that we've been talking about all day. And I think we have to be willing to look at, in a kind of syncretic and pluralistic way, many different non-Western religions and spiritualities to be able to really understand those elements of presentness, of intentionality, of expansiveness, of ways we can think about what is here and what is now and what humanness is. And so I think that if we can manage to do that and do it in a way that, you know, incorporates and, as was said, does not diminish, then we can all be better off.
Thank you so much, Damien. Thank you so much, Noreen. Thank you, Robert, so much for your time and for your contributions to the conversation today on co-opting AI religion. Very much appreciate your time and insight. We are 6 minutes over. Thank you for staying longer with us. Thank you, audience and participants, for staying with us. Very much appreciated. You can find Noreen Hertzfeld, Robert Geraci, and Damien Patrick Williams online. They are on Twitter and they have websites, and we will forward comments to them that we couldn't cover, as well as questions. And I hope to welcome you back on November 18th for our next Co-opting AI event, which will be on reproduction. So with that, my gratitude to all panelists and attendees. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. Stay safe and well. And thank you so much, everybody. Until soon.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you,
Thank
Mona.
you so
Thanks all.
much. Take care. Be well.
You as well. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.